Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We have quite a lot of people who've already joined us. Welcome to the latest webinar in the series from the Productivity Insights Network. And this afternoon, we're talking about transport, the economy and sustainability after the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Ian Doherty from the University of Stirling, and I'm one of the co-investigators on the Productivity Insights Network. The network is a collaboration between a number of universities that you can see in the slide there and some of our partners in the independent research and private sector, and it's led from the University of Sheffield and funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. This is a series of events. The next one is next week with our colleagues Richard Harris from the University of Durham and the lead of the Productivity Insights Network, Professor Philip McCann from the University of Sheffield, and they'll be talking about the prospects for firms and SMEs in particular, I think, in the economy after the pandemic. So if you want to register, you can do that at our website, and the URL is on the slide there for you. So with me this afternoon, I have Tom Forth from the Open Data Institute in Leeds. Tom has been collaborating with us on a couple of transport and mobility projects as part of the Productivity Insight Network's work. And after our short introductory presentation, we will give you a review of some data that's emerging about transport in the pandemic and some thoughts about where we go from here. We'll have most of the session as a question and answer session and debate, and that will be chaired by our colleague Adam Brown from Cambridge Econometrics. As well as the Productivity Insights Network, and myself and some colleagues from the Institute of Transport Studies at the University of Leeds are also doing a project specifically about the transport, travel, and what we call social adaptation. So that's the economic and social change, which is directly or coming about directly from the travel changes from the pandemic. That's funded by a different council from the UKRI, from the Environment and Physical Sciences Research Council. We have a website, which you can see the front page of there. And over the next few days, we'll begin to put up some of the data and findings from our project as that becomes available to you. And in the first wave, that includes a very, very large household panel survey across several regions of the UK, trying to find out, first of all, how people's habits in terms of travel have changed during the pandemic, but also, and importantly, their attitudes to how the economy will open up again and perhaps give us some insights, we hope, into how best we can generate and stimulate economic recovery. So Tom and I will kick off for about 10 minutes or so with some of our reflections on what we've seen during the pandemic so far, and then hopefully prompt some questions from you about where we go from here. So if you've been watching the UK government's 5 PM briefings from Downing Street, you'll see that until recently, they showed some of these slides on how people were using the transport network. And this one was the last time that they showed this slide, as far as I can tell from the website, and it is a reasonably well established pattern now. You can see that the usage of transport has dropped across all modes since the beginning of lockdown, but obviously that depending on the mode in question, the extent of that fall off in usage has been quite variable. So at one end, we've got car traffic levels, which fell by about 3/4, and other road vehicles, which for the use that fell even less. So for obvious reasons, given the need to keep the supply chain going for essential services like goods vehicles, and particularly HGV traffic didn't fall by nearly as much as the private modes. Public transport at the other end of the spectrum has seen the most extraordinary collapse in use. So at the minimum, the use of the rail network had declined to something like 3% of normal usage. And the really interesting thing to note from that graph in the bottom left of this slide is that even on the 16th of March, so one full week before the formal announcement of lockdown by the Prime Minister, usage of the rail network had already fallen by about 1/4 in comparison with what was expected for that time of year. So you can see that people's behaviour in terms of how they were travelling around using the public transport network was significantly in advance of the official restrictions that were put in place on lockdown. And so that obviously shows that people were adjusting their habits and they had lost confidence in the communal travel experience quite early on in this process. And there are obviously lessons we may wish to discuss about what that means for building back up public transport use as we seek to stimulate the economy. What do we know from our research about what's happening out there right now? Well, the use of all those modes is rising, and public transport use seems to be recovering by something like 10 to 15% percent per week. The use of car, however, is rebounding very strongly, and in several parts of the country we estimate that car traffic is now back up to something like 85 or even perhaps 90% of pre-lockdown use. Now, of course, you might not have seen that in terms of the congestion on the network, but we'll very soon be at absolute traffic levels. We will begin to see significant congestion return in some places across the UK. In terms of the public transport network, bus use is growing faster than rail. We're investigating some of the reasons for that, but we think that's partly because more people who are essential and key workers and more people who are in those sectors of the economy that have already reopened or indeed didn't close are more dependent on the bus than those people who tend to use trains. And there's a really important lesson in there, I think, for how we prioritise some of the investment we might need to recover from this. Something else that backs that up is that we have strong evidence that the morning peak is earlier than before. So, of course, many key workers work on shifts. The services that they rely on, particularly again in the bus network, open up early in the morning. And so we see that the busiest times on public transport tend to be very early at the moment. And I'm sure that you've read a lot of coverage in the press and the media more generally about the really significant increases in walking and cycling that we've seen. It's very unclear, however, to date whether any substantial element of that has been in terms of people commuting by the active travel modes, or indeed the extent to which they've been satisfying their essential needs in terms of food shopping, for example, by using those modes. It's very likely that a very, very significant proportion of that use of walking and cycling has been for leisure and exercise, and it's unclear whether that will be resilient as the economy reopens. What's coming up next in terms of the short term? Well, many public transport services across the UK will be at physically distanced capacity, and in some cases within days, particularly in some of the major conurbations. So at 2 metres physical distancing, the capacity of many public transport services can be as low as 12 to 15%. And even with 1 metre distancing, that maximum capacity in many circumstances doesn't rise much beyond 1/4. And that's not just because of the environment on the vehicles themselves, but importantly, it's about how we get people into and out of the vehicles and how we manage stops and stations. Congestion, as I've said, will be back very shortly given how fast traffic is rising, but so will air pollution. And again, one of the few positives to have come out of the experience of the last 12 to 14 weeks is that we've seen very, very significant improvements in local air quality in lots of places with significant social and health benefits from that. Confidence in the use of the public transport network, however, is highly uncertain, and that is something which is replicated across many aspects of the economy. So in some of our other seminars, when we look at the implications of the pandemic for particular sectors, and I suppose the one which has been most to the forefront of the media in the last few days is the reopening of the hospitality sector. Confidence in terms of people's willingness to actually use transport services and indeed to undertake economic activity in shared and indoor environments is something that we really do not know terribly much about yet. And we need to see how that rolls out as more and more of the economy reopens. And then, of course, the question about what happens in a second wave. Do we see the same change in behaviour, or is it modified in some way, as some of the behavioural scientists tell us it might be? In the long term, some key questions. How long will physical distancing need to last? If, as seems likely, there is no general return to the office until possibly January or even Easter 2021, that implies that we'll have physical distancing in many aspects of everyday life for perhaps up to almost another year. If that's the case, then our financial model for how we support the public transport network is completely upended, given the collapse in fare box revenues. But of course, the operating costs remain, if anything, the same, but possibly higher. We don't know, given all of that, whether public transport use will ever fully recover to the levels that we saw before the pandemic. And of course, that together with the question about how much of working at home will stick and how people will blend their work days between commuting to the office and working at home in future, We don't know what that tells us about many aspects of the economy, not just the use of the transport network, but in particular, whether we'll see a spatial restructuring of the economy and whether the trend to moving more and more people into denser and denser city centre environments to capture particular kinds of economic benefits, which has been at the forefront of policymakers' minds for the last 10 or 15 years. We don't know whether we will ever return to that kind of situation. And finally, for me, a kind of set of second order questions that arise from that. So if the use of particularly public transport is significantly less in future, how do we justify investment in new infrastructure? And are many of those schemes that we thought of as essential for the economy now unlikely to go ahead in the foreseeable future? And equally, how do we pay for the upkeep of the infrastructure we've already got? And if usage changes radically, what does that do for some of the really difficult policy priorities that or policy questions rather, we've been kicking down the can down the road on for many years? And the one, of course, which comes to mind immediately is road pricing. And for the academics out there, does all of this mean that transport economics survives in its current form at all? Given that within the space of 3 months, our understandings about what was possible in terms of working from home and the importance of physically moving ourselves around and the value of time while we move, do we have to rebuild transport economics and the allied professions from scratch? Okay. And I'm going to pass over to Tom, who's going to talk about some data and what that tells us about some of those questions, I think.
I am not going to be a huge amount of data, but that in itself is important. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. I think the important one is the top one. Transport data is proving the best global proxy for economic activity. We'll talk a little bit about that and whether we are happy with that. The second one will be about culture. So that's a Jacob Rees-Mogg slide. And then the third one will be about whether we, working in this field, are getting too excited, whether we need to just calm down a little bit. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start there. So I think most people have seen this. It's the best data that I think we have internationally, but also within the UK on economic activity, how it has declined since the start of the pandemic and how it has returned since then. This work is done by Dan Cookson, who's up kind of northeast of Edinburgh somewhere, but does fantastic work with data and has analysed all of the Google mobility data by different country. You can also look at it by region, really quite small zones within the UK there. It's some fantastic work showing how quickly the UK entered lockdown and how quickly we're coming out. The news at the moment for our economy isn't particularly good. We're clearly one of the slowest to return to anywhere near normal. I think my question on here is, we were all meant to be in the world of understanding productivity and economics. We were meant to be understanding what was happening in terms of transport. Transport was something that we all kind of agree is, you know, a big thing in terms of increasing productivity. And yet when it came to a pandemic, the only way that we had in the UK to understand patterns of transport, really, the only big way to do it was to get Google to give us some data. So I think that the work that ITS and Leeds are doing is really important in trying to get some other angles into this data. But I think we need to ask ourselves some hard questions about why we didn't have this data for ourselves and how we build that back up. So the second thing I want to talk about is culture, and it's something that I've not heard, I think, quite enough discussion about. I think that there's a researcher, Matthew Clancy, he's at Iowa State University, who's looking at the culture of remote work, and effectively that means the culture of necessity in travel, because most of our travel for economic purposes is not something that we like doing. We don't really enjoy it. We choose to do it. We can see that in all of the data on how miserable people with longer commutes are. We just see that they don't like traveling. So if we have an alternative about traveling, just pop back for me, Ian, for a second. Oh, I've jumped through there. if we see that we have an alternative to traveling, people will choose it. But the challenge here is, will our culture adapt? So on the right is a picture of the UK Parliament lining up in a big queue to vote for an hour because they refused culturally to make any adaptation to not traveling. So you've got people traveling 300 miles to go and stand in that queue to vote on behalf of their constituents. And all of the work that Matt Clancy's done at Iowa looks at different reasons that people give for not wanting to travel and whether there's a good case economically for that happening or not. And I really strongly recommend looking at that because it tells us, I think, which areas of returning to work are likely to be required and which areas of work can be done long-term remotely. So the last thing to look at is some work that we've done in Scotland first, and you can play around with that website looking at Scotland isochrones. These are pretty standard stuff in accessibility for transport mapping. So we can see how accessible, in this case, Glasgow, but you can do it for anywhere in Scotland, our cities and our places are by different modes of travel. And what you see quite quickly is that walking doesn't get you very far in UK big cities. Cycling doesn't actually get you that far either. And that public transport can get you quite far, but as Ian just mentioned earlier, there isn't much space on it anymore. And so what we are seeing, I can see it out my window right now in central Manchester, is people are returning to driving. And if we don't be honest about that, we may not want that to happen, but if it's happening, you need to be honest about it.
At that point, Tom is frozen.
Point on this is the work of Dr. Robin Lovelace at the Institute of Transport Studies in Leeds. I think that it's really good work on saying, if we wanted to put cycle lanes places, where would we put them? So I'd urge you to have a look at that work. It does show how we could spend quite a lot of money in the next 2 years on creating reasonable cycle networks to try and alleviate some of the capacity problems we're now going to have with getting people into and out of cities. But I think we need to be realistic as well that most people aren't going to use that method. So I think that's it from me. Sorry if my connection dropped out in the middle of that, but I'm still here now, so hopefully we're okay.
Okay, thanks very much, Tom. Adam, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Ian, for a really kind of fascinating and insightful discussion. I think obviously there's a lot more questions than there are answers at the moment, and there's probably a lot more theories floating around than evidence as to what's going to happen. We've still got a good kind of 40 minutes left, so I would really encourage all the audience to get on the Q&A and put down some questions of your own, start voting up whatever questions are there. We've got one to start off with. So I'll read this one out. And then I think as we've got kind of plenty of time, I think maybe we'll take one question at a time, seeing as we've only got one question. But I would encourage everyone else to start putting some questions in there as well. So the first question is from Jen Nellis, and she asks, can you elaborate a bit more about the financial model? What impacts do you anticipate the short to medium term impacts of fare revenue collapse that will be? Are some providers at risk of failure or major service reductions? And she gives the example of the MTA in New York not operating at night anymore. And in what places might this happen? And are these the most vulnerable? So, Ian, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I'll have a go, Adam. So, as part of our research, doing a round of interviews with senior people from across the sector, we're asking them exactly this. So, one of the things which one of our respondents said, which I think struck a chord with me, is that the rail network in the UK is possibly the most bailed out sector of the economy of all. Because not only is it being told to keep going with effectively a blank check for the short term, but it's actually been told to spend more money and take this as an opportunity to try and do more maintenance. And it will probably be given even more capital funds funding in the short term to try and create some construction jobs as part of the shovel-ready economic recovery strategy that we expect the UK government to announce in the next sort of 7 to 10 days. But the sums of money that are involved in this are absolutely eye-watering. And we're not that far away. We weren't that far away before the pandemic to spending something like, I don't know, 0.75 of a percentage point, even higher, of GDP on the rail network alone. And clearly that's an enormous amount of money at any time, given the relatively small proportion of mobility that it represents. But given what's going to happen to the public finances, at some point very soon, very difficult political questions are going to be asked about whether we can afford to spend the number of billions on public transport that we do. On the other hand, there is no such thing as a commercial public transport service left in the UK at the moment. Not a single one of them at 20% or 25% capacity covers its operating costs, probably. So at that point, a whole set of really interesting questions do open up. I think, as Jen's alluding to here, about whether the mixed economy of operation that we've had for the last 30 years or so in terms of private operation or delivery of large parts of the network is sustainable.
Yeah,
and then in the medium term, the final element of that is about the cost base and about some of our assumptions. So again, on the rail network side, it's hugely dependent on peak demand in terms of what we plan for. So you look at the rail services that go in and out of any of our major cities, but particularly London, Crossrail, which is not yet open, designed to move even more hundreds of thousands of people a day in the peak in and out of London. If we've got substantial move to working at home permanently, and we no longer have those very peak demands, then the justification for that level of investment becomes really, really difficult.
Yeah, I think Ian's point there was really important about the different models, and the fact that in the UK we have chosen to run public transport for a large part as a commercially viable service. Well, none are commercially viable at the moment. So one of the interesting comparisons you'll see is, let's take Transport for London. It instantly loses all of its fare revenue, almost all of it, and therefore requires a bailout. There is no other option. It doesn't matter whether Transport for London were charging £500 per ticket on the bus. They aren't going to cover the cost of running the bus. So we had this model in London which required a bailout but can continue operating. What we had in the rest of the UK was privatised bus companies that were meant to hold the risk. So the reason why government weren't controlling the privatised bus companies was because the privatised bus companies held the risk. But what we see is that as soon as something goes wrong, and no one could have perceived it, no one could have predicted it, but as soon as something goes wrong, actually it is the public sector that holds the risk. So the bus companies have had to be bailed out, and rightly so. I think it's useful looking at an international example on this. So public transport in French cities has not been particularly badly affected in terms of business model, because the vast majority of the income comes from a tax on business. So if the businesses keep paying the tax to fund the public transport, which is a local tax on businesses in the agglomeration, then they can keep running. So I think we should take this opportunity to look at that kind of model and then ask ourselves whether that's proven itself more resilient, and maybe whether it was better anyway. That's an opportunity for us now. I've no idea about New York City, I'm afraid, Jen, sorry. Okay,
great. Good answers there. Thanks, guys. We've got questions are starting to come in a bit quicker now. This is good. So we've got an anonymous question about the way in which we appraise different transport options. So the question is, the value of time savings or value of travel time savings is a huge part of what we count in working out which transport projects to build. And the question is this now all moot? So
well, I've never liked value of travel time savings anyway, Adam. I think that a better way is to look at the size of the city. So you build public transport to achieve scale rather than to save people time, because we know that people just choose to travel for longer once you build them time savings. So The question there does become even more important, because suddenly what you've got is at a quarter of the capacity of your existing public transport network, the size of your city just shrunk enormously. They've all become much smaller. So I think that it will push us more to moving to that way of looking at the value of transport investment as a achieving scale, not about saving time.
I fully agree with that, Adam, and I have to say I don't really mourn that. I think we've made some fairly questionable decisions because of how long our attachment to the value of time has stuck around. And if anybody's interested in particularly how that feeds into the appraisal system that we've been trying, I would argue unsuccessfully, to modify for the last couple of decades, then Robin Hickman from UCL, his work on this is really excellent, and I'd recommend that to you.
Great. Second anonymous question. Cities are going to run into problems of topology with insufficient space for the required movement of goods and people into their cores by certain modes. How do they prioritize between the additional space required for people, either walking or cycling, or the movement of goods by road? It's a tricky one.
So I think it's a good question now. It's an important one.
Do you want to go first, Tom?
Well, just quickly on it. Topology kind of rules everything in transport, and Barcelona and Paris are your two European examples of as dense as you can get, right? That's 3 million people in central Paris. You can cycle from one side of it to the other. You can get to any job you like. But Paris is a city of 12 million. So beyond that kind of 3 million core, that's your natural kind of cap on city size if you are going to rely on walking and cycling. If you rely on cars, I mean, it's game over, right? You live in a world of small cities. They can sprawl on forever. They can be 10 million people, but no one in one side of them can get to the other side. So they don't effectively work as that. So I think topology is going to be really interesting. Within cities, I think prioritizing walking and cycling has always been, will always be just the best way to move the most number of people. We just have to look at it, just judge transport on that. But it does link to another question, which is important, which is these out of town or on the ring road office parks are quite attractive now. Suddenly, if your employees say, I want to drive to work, and if they own a car and if they live in the suburbs, then these places are quite cheap. And we are seeing some really quite high demand for them at the moment. So I suspect that's going to change quite a bit what our cities look like unless there's some intervention. And in the UK, there will be intervention because the planning system won't let things get built. So even if we want out-of-town office parks, we aren't going to build them.
So if you think back to the first slide I think I showed, which was the briefing from, or the transport slide from the last UK government briefing where they talked about transport use. And a couple of days before that, Chris Boardman, who is the active travel commissioner for the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, said that what we did in the next 20 days would determine what cities look like for the next 20 years. Now, that was more than 20 days ago, I think, already. So what worries me about that is that given how fast car traffic has rebounded and how it will be back to something approaching 90% within days now, that we've got very, very, very little time left to try and lock in some of the changes that we've seen in behaviour. Because you can be sure that, as Tom says, when the kind of office-based economy goes back to work, people are going to be an exaggerated version of themselves before. So whereas congestion in many of our cities was really quite severe, and many people travelling by car didn't understand things like bus priority and didn't understand and didn't want pricing and all the things that we've used hesitatingly to try and manage the impact of car traffic on urban environments and the economy, all that stuff is going to be really concentrated because they're going to be looking at buses that are a quarter full, for example, and thinking, why do they have their own space? There's not that many people using them. They should all be in a car. So the debate that we've had over the last 20 years about trying to kind of slowly move cities away from a private car dependent ecosystem to something that's a bit more balanced in terms of modal shift, that's going to be really, really difficult to continue to manage. So the fights about the reallocation of road space that we've seen in the relatively few cases where it's been attempted to any significant extent in the UK, I think they're going to come back really quickly. And of course, the very few places that have taken advantage of the additional funding for pop-up bike lane schemes and other things, these cities are going to come under real pressure to take a courageous decision about whether to make them permanent or not. I mean, I think the case to reallocate road space has never been stronger, but the political pressure that local authorities will come over to give space back to the car is going to be huge.
There's actually kind of an interesting example in terms of some of our more productive and successful cities already have this topology that Tom talked about in terms of Oxford and Cambridge, because the city centres are so dominated by kind of tourism and colleges. A lot of the knowledge firms tend to be dispersed around the outside, and so maybe that's what we're going to see in the future. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'll leave for the audience to decide.
Yeah, we're not Amsterdam. That's the weird thing there, Adam. Exactly as you said, right? We don't have this kind of Dutch style city which has cyclably accessible out of town office. We just don't have it. There is no example in the UK. We've either got York, Oxford, Cambridge, small city that maybe had a wall in the past or something, or we've got big sprawling things with out of town office parks that you drive to.
Great. Okay, so we have a question from Gemma Little. So this is, in the past, modal shift from the car was achieved through providing public transport and cycling alternatives alongside restrictions like road closures and pricing of parking. How far can councils go in terms of road closures or pricing now, and what other measures might be needed to manage congestion in the next phase of the COVID crisis? Ian, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I'll have a go at that one first. Excellent question, Gemma. The thing I'd add to that is that we have seen and are going to need to continue to see, at least for the medium term, a kind of emergency change in the geographic operation of our cities. So we're going to have to try and keep people as local as possible in terms of servicing basic needs like food shopping, for example, in order to avoid the capacity problems on public transport, and also just the capacity of shops and other elements of economic activity. So there's a major policy effort in a lot of towns and cities at the moment to try and support local high streets as best as possible. Now that adds another level of complication to what you talk about, because of course local high streets are exactly where the conflict between space for pedestrians and people who are actually using local facilities and cyclists who are trying to make sustainable journeys to or from them. And they tend to be on key bus corridors used by key workers going to hospitals and the other services which are continuing to work. And then, of course, you've got continuing car traffic. So what you've got is an amplified and exaggerated version of all of the road space conflicts that we've tried to manage and often haven't done very well in doing. So this is not an easy choice for local authorities. And my personal view on this is that I think we have to give up on mode shift for the foreseeable future. I think people who have got the option to use a car are going to want to use it as much as they can for a whole set of reasons. So the ones that we've had before, it's there. Fuel prices, of course, have fallen, so the cost of using a car will be very low in comparison with recently for a lot of people when they start to become more mobile again, or are becoming more mobile again. And then there's the confidence issue about a lot of people who have the car option who tend to kind of flip between using the car, and particularly the train, will choose to stick in the car. So to me, I think this means that the absolutely key policy intervention here is to make sure that people who have been working at home continue to work at home rather than get in a car and drive to an office. So I think the mode shift here really has to be between the private car and digital connectivity.
Yeah, just I agree on all of that. So I'll just add the extra thing that I think is important. Ask any economist and they'll tell you you should charge more for parking and charge for roads. And ask any local councillor who was an economist until they became a local councillor, and they'll immediately tell you it isn't happening. So I completely agree. There's no way, I cannot imagine how a local authority is going to get in high car parking charges. The pressure will be so enormous to make parking free that I can't see it being resisted. There is one big hope that I can see though, which is we know that a lot of the places that people want to drive to offer hospitality, restaurants, pubs, that kind of thing. We know that they probably have to operate outside more than they have done. Most people who absolutely love driving and parking places absolutely love sitting outside and having a nice meal or a pint. And there is some opportunity to say that a lot of the parking that we currently have, which sits outside restaurants and bars that are at risk of going broke, could be turned into space for people to eat and drink. So I think that's something that I know a lot of local authorities are looking at, and I think it could really change what our cities look and feel like. So pedestrianise a few roads, turn a few car parking spaces into tables and chairs for restaurants and drinking, and I think you could get quite a lot of buy-in into it. And I'm sure that people will be working on that now in all local governments in the UK.
Yeah, I agree with that, and we've begun to see some examples of that. So City of Westminster published its first indicative plan on that on Tuesday, I think. And up here in Scotland, I know that Edinburgh, Glasgow City Councils are looking at the same thing. An interesting point there is about the legal framework for how difficult it can be to do anything in the transport network. So the traffic regulation orders and the processes that local authorities had to go through. Some of that was loosened in the coronavirus emergency legislation, but we just haven't been able to flick a switch and to reallocate this space to outdoor hospitality activity in the way that lots of continental cities have been able to do because of the legal and decision-making frameworks that their local governments have got over the economy and the transport system.
We've got Alistair Baldwin on the call, Ian. Do you know Alistair Baldwin? He's on the call anyway. Anyone listening in can ask him. He'll know exactly the pain of this. Yeah, it's in some Dutch city, you might go and park a trailer that says this car park's now closed. It's a restaurant, and that could happen tomorrow. That ain't happening in Manchester or Edinburgh.
So one of the things that I think we really need to learn from this experience is about we can actually take decisions faster than we thought we could. And we really have to change our mindset, I think, to be much more, to use those words, flexible, agile about what we do with space and how we change it depending on the time of day of the week, month of the year. But also we need to have decision frameworks that are able to make future decisions as quickly as some of them have been made during the pandemic.
Great. Okay. We've got a few more questions in. So Ben Gardner asks, how would you imagine the next, sorry, I lost the question, travel to work map of the UK to look like, which is due to be calculated from next year's census, of course?
Right. I love this one because travel to work area is really important. The whole concept is kind of ridiculous. And what I like about this catastrophe is that it's going to show how ridiculous travel to work area is in terms of calculating it from a census. What is a travel to work area? Well, if more and more of us only work 3 days a week, it's obviously just a bizarre effort. And the idea that it's only about 8:30 until 5 o'clock when you go home is also quite weird. We should have the data that tells us what our travel to work area is in real time. If you look at that Google real-time data on mobility, they can tell you the effective travel to work area every single day. And there is no reason why we shouldn't be thinking in that sense in the UK going forward. So in terms of travel to work area, my suspicion is, to be honest, Ben, I don't think it will change because most travel to work is by car and car commuting is not going to be affected a huge amount, I don't think. But in terms of what the real geography of travel to work area is, I think it should and must change quite significantly. And I think that if we get this right, it will dilute there will be less travel to work. So you'll still have the same area, but there'll just be less of it.
Yeah, so I mean, again, I'm in full agreement, I think, with all of that. One other of the interviewees that my Leeds colleagues and I talked to last week on our current project, looking at all this stuff, was a regional director for a very large financial services firm, which you'll all know across the UK. And he volunteered the view that of those people who were full-time employees before the pandemic, they averaged something like 4.5 days a week in the office. And when they go back to office working, whenever they expect that to be, let's say January, they don't expect that number to get back above 2 point something for the foreseeable future. So, you know, these are potential shifts in the level of travel to work, as Tom's just said, that have thought were impossible before. And all of a sudden we've got major private sector employers actively planning for them to occur in a matter of months. And one thing that I'm keen to say to people in these whole debates about, you know, what's happening in mobility during the pandemic is that, you know, this is an unprecedented crisis and emergency in our lifetimes, but so is the climate emergency, and it hasn't gone away. And we've told ourselves for at least 10 or 15 years now that we can't modal shift our way out of the climate crisis. We have to reduce the need to travel substantially. So the opportunity to reduce the need to travel for work very substantially in lots of sectors of the economy is right there in front of us. And even some major private sector employers that had been really skeptical about the impact of that on their business have changed completely their assumptions about their future productivity and sustainability within the last 3 months. You know, so to come back to Chris Morpen's point, there is a window of opportunity to act here, but we really do have to take it over the next few months. Otherwise, I think we'll just see the status quo ante return, possibly quite slowly, but we'll still embed it for another decade or two. And of course, if you believe the climate science, then that is too late.
Yeah. Just on this opportunity to act point as well, just in case there's anybody on this call who wants to act, has the power to act, there's two things that basically all transport people have been saying for a decade needs to happen, and that is make it so that on buses and trains, you don't have to buy a season ticket. You need to make it so that travelling to work for 3 days out of 5 a week costs you 3/5 of travelling to work every day, or else you've got this incentive to keep on travelling because it's free, right? You have your season ticket on the train, you have your monthly ticket on the bus, you make the journey because it's free. We need very quickly to make sure that we get out of that mindset within. So the UK rail system would be the first place to do it. There's this review, Williams review, which I still don't know what's going on with it. Whether it came out or not in this coronavirus mess, I don't know, because it was delayed so much before it. But we need to end periodic ticketing on these public transport modes and replace it with something much better, or else we will lose it. And that probably needs to happen 2 weeks ago, but we might have still another 2 weeks. There's some good companies as well in the UK working on it. I've seen, like, for example, Cardiff Bus have done a quite good job on it, I think. There's other places that have done well, but it needs to be really looked at urgently.
And the second thing?
Oh, sorry, that was both of them, buses and trains. Yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
That's another example, Adam, though, of things that we knew we needed to do before the pandemic, because the average use of rail season tickets has fallen to, I think, less than 4 days, or something like the 4-day threshold, before the pandemic started. So, you know, we knew these things were happening. We knew that the trends were going to continue in that direction. What we didn't expect, of course, was the likely massive acceleration of lots of them. So it's not as if we haven't thought some of this stuff through. What we need to do now is put measures in place to act upon them.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes left. There's 4 questions. So what I'll do is I'll pair these. So I'll read you 2 questions, and maybe we can try and tackle them. Ooh. And then we'll have the kind of the final 2 questions. So first, we've got a follow-up from Jen Nellis, which is an interesting question. I know it's impossible to predict but would be interested in your thoughts about the spatial implications, given the return to cars and the slow return to not full capacity transit. What impacts do you think we're going to see in terms of the spatial configurations of cities and places? Will we see further decentralization of economic activity, or is this just going to be a blip? And the second question from Alistair Baldwin, if we're removing value of time as being so important, how do you convince HMT and NAO that other modes are as good an idea to put that investment into, assuming that DFT are at least partly on board? So two questions there, one about the kind of spatial implications and one about convincing HMT without having value of time calculations. Who wants to jump in there?
I'll get in quick and then get out. So first one, spatial considerations. I think that the UK is in a completely weird situation on this, whereby we need to make sure that we don't look at any other country's data or thinking. We need to understand that a lot of people in Manchester, and it will be the same in Leeds and Birmingham, wherever, have long wanted to move to the suburbs, but they cannot afford to. So we have this weird situation in the UK. It's unlike most other places in the world, where our cities are actually cheap and our suburbs are quite expensive. And that's because we refuse to build more houses in the suburbs. So I think, in answer to Jen's question, I think there will be quite a push to decentralize our cities and our economies and people to move to the suburbs and to out of town office parks. I just don't think that it's going to be allowed to happen in the UK. All of that building will not be given planning permission. And then the second one on how do we convince NAO and DFT, I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to this. I don't think that the UK government is very good at deciding what to invest its money in on infrastructure. The good thing is it doesn't actually care, in my experience, what the business case is. So we don't need to worry about fixing the business case methodologies to not value travel of time and value agglomeration more. What we need to do is spend our time showing Dominic Cummings some pretty graphs in the hope that he'll overrule everyone and make it happen anyway.
Ian?
Yeah, so on Jen's question, yeah, it is impossible to predict, but let's have a go. I think you'll see some more segmenting of behaviour, probably. So, you know, at one end, you've got the lovely anecdotal stuff about estate agents in deepest rural Devon and the Orkney Islands have never had more inquiries about people wanting to move out of cities because they value space and safety, and it's opened their eyes to a kind of different set of choices. And so I'm kind of sceptical about the whole argument about that cities are over, because we've heard that a lot, but they rebuilt themselves after the war. I remember reading some of the stuff that was written after 9/11 about the future of New York and other major cities in the US, etc. Indeed, Tom and I wrote about that in our first blog on this for PIN the other week. So I'm skeptical about the kind of end of the spectrum that says the end of cities. I do think, though, we might see, as Tom says, an increased demand for people to have the kind of house that best facilitates the life that they're living now and are likely to do if they go to work less, in terms of traveling to the office. You know, so one of the really profound impacts of the pandemic in a societal sense is that it really has reinforced inequality in the most dreadful way in many sectors of socioeconomic life. So not just the statistics in terms of the direct health outcomes of the virus amongst different parts of the population, but, you know, I'm a shielded person, for example, but I'm lucky enough to live in one of those big houses by the station in the burbs with a garden and a spare room that I can do this kind of thing from and work from. And so, to be honest, has this experience been really hard for me? In that sense, no. If I'd been being the same person on a lower income in an apartment crammed into the city centre, yeah, absolutely, this experience would have been really much, much more difficult and would continue to be. So, you know, people that have got more assets have done better out of this, and so the kind of general wealth inequality divide in terms of lived experiences, I think it's become really visible, and we need to talk about that. And I think what we need to talk about it in most urgent terms is what this tells us about the already really difficult generational problems we've got. And this is another link between transport, the morphology of cities and how we organise them, wealth and quality of life. So we've got a pandemic here where the effects are massively unequally distributed across age groups and across income groups. And effectively, we're asking, in the UK at least, younger people who already have difficult life choices in terms of the housing market and affordability, and that Tom's talked about, but other aspects of life, we're asking them to take on a lot of debt and a really deep, really long economic recession, and we don't have much of a plan to get out of it. So if the outcome of that was that we were to reinforce all of that these people face, making it even harder to get a job, even harder to get a home in the right place, then we really need to begin to think about that. And the transport system, and frankly, the level to which we are happy to let a kind of 1960s car-dependent suburban model recover is going to have implications for particularly young people for decades to come, and we really need to get a handle on that quickly. On the Treasury and National Audit Office, etc., as Tom says, there's a kind of rule book, codified rule book, and things like the Green Book that exists. It's really hard to make a case that it's followed in terms of what we choose to spend our money on and what we don't. Life's a lot more complicated than that, and this thing called politics intervenes quite a lot, which is why we have things like HS2 and why we have things like the railways at all, and why we don't pay very much attention to the bus, for example. So these things are always political choices which are justified to some extent by what the rule book says. One thing I think we have learned, though, is that we've designed our transport networks to be efficient and to spend as little money as possible on them until relatively recently. So about 10 or 15 years ago now, I remember interviewing somebody from the Treasury who thought it was a national triumph that Britain had spent 40% less as a proportion of our GDP on transport infrastructure for 40 years than every other country in Europe. The problem now is that we realised that we might have been quite efficient in terms of our expenditure of public capital on the infrastructure that we've got, but it really hasn't been very resilient, has it? So I think the answer to Alistair's question is probably that if we want to be resilient to future events, another pandemic, but not just fighting the last war, another event which is a real exogenous shock to the economy, we have to value the resilience of the network much, much, much better than we've done up till now.
Okay. And finally, last two questions, unless there are any more that come in quickly. I'll pair these together again. So firstly, Kate Penny asks, what do you think the lack of confidence in public transport is? Is it hygiene, reliability, reduced services, etc.? Do we know? And Eric Leslie asks, on a slightly different topic, if there is a large change to home working, could that lead to demand for cities to change to places for socializing, leisure, human activity, rather than as places of business? I mean, I'd argue that that is already the case to some extent, but who wants to answer these two first?
I'll jump in first again, just makes it easy. Number one, the lack of confidence in public transport. I think we're seeing more and more studies come out saying that actually public transport isn't that dangerous in terms of transmitting the virus. The challenge for us, especially in the UK, is going to be communicating that in a way that people can trust. We've lost a lot of ground on trust in public communications in the last 3 months. So if you were to say, in Sweden, could we get people back using the metro in Stockholm or the trams in Gothenburg? Probably yes, because their government has been reasonably honest with them and clear and frank. So I think that it's a confidence issue. It looks like public transport actually could be quite safe, but people need to be able to trust that, and at the moment they can't. The second one, I think, is really important. We've definitely been moving in this way where we say cities are moving away from being places for shops alone, and they are moving towards being more about socializing, leisure, that kind of stuff. Also some mixes between living and working. I think this has to massively accelerate that. It's another one of these things where we saw the direction that we were going. we knew that we probably weren't moving quick enough. Now we suddenly have this decision. And if we don't get it right quite quickly, then we lock ourselves into a model that we probably don't want in the long term. So absolutely, the idea that you go to the office less, but you go out and meet your friends in cities more is definitely what most people think should be happening. And I think there's all kinds of important ecological reasons for that. I mean, in terms of having a sustainable economy that we all enjoy, meeting our friends and having a nice meal is a lot better for the environment than buying lots of clothes we don't need from shops, right? This is just people enjoy it more, but it's also more sustainable. I think we have to move in that direction really quite aggressively if that's what we think we want to do.
Yeah, so on Kate's question on messaging, first of all, Tom's points again, I think are pretty much on the money. We're investigating this in our research right now, so we're asking people on our big panel survey about the confidence issues. The very, very early indications from that and some other survey work that I've seen are that this isn't quite as big an issue as we might have feared. But then I think that's because there are some people, key workers in particular, younger people for whom this is not as much of an issue, partly because they've been told to get on with it. To put it bluntly, because they're not people that have been lucky enough to be able to work at home, and they've had to keep some already difficult lives going by using the public transport services that are there, and also the demographics. So, you know, younger people we know are less concerned about the personal health impacts of the pandemic on their own, on themselves as individuals, and so their confidence levels appear to be reasonably resilient. But that's really early data, and it's sketchy and it might change. Public transport operators are really, really worried though about obviously the messaging. So, you know, when you have the Secretary of State for Transport stand up at a UK government briefing and tell people it's their civic duty to avoid the public transport network, when all the messaging for 3 months has been about the fact that the network is dangerous, then for certain groups in the population, that's enough for them probably never to go back to use those services again. And of course, you know, in hindsight, again, as Tom alluded to, there were probably other ways to do that. So if the message had been more along the lines of that TfL have tried to use from the outset, that said, public transport capacity is limited, save it for key workers, that would probably have had almost the same desired effect, but would have had a whole set of different implications for changing the messaging as we move out of the pandemic. But, you know, we'll have to see that. So I suspect there'll be a huge kind of variety and a segmenting effect across the population, but what that means for future travel behaviour. On the future cities point, again, you know, furious agreement with Tom. It's taken us a long time to move away from the kind of monolithic land use zoning type approach to cities that we've got, where you're actually allowed to go to the shops and eat in the same place. You know, that's only really happened in the last decade or so in many of our town and city centres, except now we would, you know, take it for granted. So I think we're going to have to get much better. It comes back to this governance and decision making point. Actually, we're going to have to get much better about making sure the rules reflect where we are, where we're going, and what we actually want to do, rather than try to impose some kind of rigidity on how things used to be.
Great, thanks, Ian. Well, I think we've kind of come to the end of the Q&A session. So, Ian, I'll hand over to you to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks for that, Adam. So, thank you to you for very ably chairing the Q&A session, and thank you very much to Tom for participating again today, and thank you to all of you for attending our webinar. So, as we said at the beginning, this is one of a series of events that the Productivity Insights Network is running online over the next few weeks, and we're trying to give you an insight into the research that we're doing across the network, which is very varied in terms of our understanding of the productivity question across different parts of the economy and society. So I hope that you've found it useful today. Thank you very much for spending your time online and joining us, and I hope that you're able to come back and participate in one of the other sessions still to come. So thank you very much, and stay safe, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.